we hope to have a couple more of the commissioners here. I know Bill Stevens was due, but whatever happened, not able to attend, at least not yet. The first thing we'll do is do basic introductions and opening ceremonies, and then we'll do a roll call. First, let's do the Pledge of Allegiance, please.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible.
Play ball. Sorry for the confusion and the delay. We ended up with a bit of a quorum issue, but we're holding this as a workshop and we cannot vote on anything, but there was no plan to vote on any measures today anyway. So I think we're fine. The reason for this is to share some information that we've been collecting with the help of some of the folks who will be speaking with you and making presentations today. I'll introduce them in a minute, but first I need to do a roll call of those who are present. So, who's a member of our committee? Dave Davis, I'm a member of the committee. Stacy Hanna, we have via Zoom, and that's the reason for the delay. We were short one person. There were two people that I think were supposed to come, but maybe have not joined the Zoom meeting yet, so we'll see. So we have not quite a quorum, but we can hold the meeting as we intended anyway, thank goodness. And also we have Commissioner Persinger, and we have Town Manager Bill Zolper here with us, and so they're representative of the the additional people in the workshop. Next thing I want to do is do the adoption of the agenda. I can't do that. I can't. Okay, so we'll skip that and just assume that everybody's okay with the agenda. It's going to be a very nice, easy meeting to hold. Okay, so the next order of business is we're going to have a series of presentations from some folks to give us a level set on the whole situation of what's being done by various organizations in Sussex County and beyond that in Greater Delaware. People who we've been talking to, and they've been able to share a great deal of information about the opportunities available to us to help with wrestling this alligator we call climate change here for the town of Dewey Beach. I'll introduce them first and just read off the list here. Danielle Swallow, Coastal Hazards Specialist, Delaware Sea Grant. Raise your hand, Danielle. Michelle Schmidt, Director, Conservation and Watershed Planning for the Center of the Inland Bays. Many are familiar with Michelle. Jennifer Pongratz, Environmental Scientist at DENREC. Thank you, Jennifer. And Joseph Ferries, who's also with DENREC. He will also be giving some information to us. Before we start, I just wanted to give a little bit of background. There was a Rascal is the, help me with the
Resilient and sustainable.
At a summit on Monday that several of us attended, and it was a great way to get an enormous amount of information about who's doing what, not only in terms of the project work, but the funding sources, things of that nature, all the things that we've been sort of struggling with for these past few meetings since the committee was formed. And we have some great new information about the opportunities ahead. In particular, there's two funding sources that we're going to tap into right away. It's called GAP, it's a Grant Assistance Program associated with the University of Delaware, and also a BRIC program out of DEMA, and Phil Kane gave a presentation on that. Those seem to be the two first order of business folks will want to talk to in terms of setting up opportunities for the town to gain some funding to do the projects and even some of the studies for the projects. We also saw presentations from some of the nearby municipalities of some successes that they've had and projects that they've done. And the main thing that we want to do today is get everybody a background on what's now available to us, the work that's already being done in the surrounding communities, and really give us a sense of, okay, here's the base that we start from. With that, I'll turn it over to the first presenter. Michelle, I think we said that you'd be a good first presenter for us. So please, if you would.
I am a generally very loud person, so if I end up screaming into this microphone, please just tell me. I cannot be Danielle today, sorry. While she's getting that up, I guess I can further introduce myself. My name is Michelle Schmidt. I am the Director of Conservation and Watershed Planning for the Center for Inland Bays. I've been with the center for 5 years now, and I've been working closely with Dewey Beach for the last at least 3.5, 4 years on the Stormwater Master Plan and trying to figure out how to get some of these projects funded. And so I'm here today to continue talking about that and to talk more about nature-based solutions, why they're important, how they can be helpful to the town, and I will give a little bit more information about the Stormwater Master Plan as well. So nature-based solutions, what are those? I put up here 3 different definitions, one from FEMA, World Bank, and the United Nations, and right off the bat, you'll notice that they are very, very wordy. They're very long, but they all contain the same concepts. Nature-based solutions are those solutions that protect the environment as well as communities against various hazards like climate change, while providing co-benefits to both the environment and people. So, we're using words like economic challenges, engineering practices, natural ecosystems, but it all really comes down to finding ways to handle our problems that benefits both people and the environment. And, oh my goodness.
Very quick presentation.
Did I do that? Sorry about that. Apparently I am the Flash today. Okay.
There we go.
So nature-based solutions have a few different names. They're also known as green infrastructure. That's the term that the center usually uses when we're referring to these types of practices. They can also be known as natural infrastructure, bioengineering, which is not as common, but you do see that sometimes. And then engineering with nature, which is actually a U.S. Army Corps of Engineer initiative, which is why it has the copyright symbol next to it. So word, I'm going to fly through everything again. Why use nature-based solutions? I put this table up here just to show you the differences between the different types of practices. So on the left side, on the right side, you have the built or your typical gray infrastructure. So those are the seawalls, those are the bulkheads, those types of really engineered construction practices to solve a problem. And then you have your hybrid and your natural solutions, and that's really what we're talking about when we say nature-based. So hybrid does use a combination of those engineered hard structures along with some of those ecosystem environmental services type practices. And the benefit of the hybrid and the natural or nature-based solutions is that unlike gray infrastructure, and we'll use the example of a flood wall. So flood walls or gray infrastructure, they are designed to address one single problem. So your flood wall, your seawall, that's to prevent water from going any further, to prevent flooding, and that's it. A nature-based solution alternative would be a living shoreline. So the living shoreline will also halt some of that, or take care of some of that wave energy, but it will also provide a lot of other ecosystem services. So habitat, it'll also help to build up sediment on the other side, whereas a seawall no longer allows that sediment to move past. So you can see how there's a lot of co-benefits, and something with an nature-based solution will also help with water quality. They tend to look better, and so there's just a bunch of co-benefits. And I've listed So I've listed here some of those specific co-benefits. Hazard mitigation and improving environmental conditions are probably the first that you think of when you think of nature-based solutions, of course. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So hazard mitigation, one thing that you all are familiar with in Dewey Beach is flooding. So that's the hazard mitigation, and that's what we can use nature-based solutions to solve. This is Reed Avenue. This Reed Avenue at this time is experiencing some pretty intense coastal flooding. One way to address this is with, again, a living shoreline. And so that is actually what we did. That's actually what we did. This is the living shoreline at Reed Avenue. And this shoreline has actually been pretty good at abating some of that flooding that has been occurring over the years on Reed Avenue. And so we did use some stone structure. This is a braided reef out here. And then we planted some vegetation to help build back a little bit of that marsh as well. And so not only are we solving the hazard of flooding, but we are also helping to filter out some nutrients with that reef. We're also providing habitat, and it also looks really nice, I think, or at least this picture looks nice. Another hazard that you all have dealt with is from flooding from stormwater. This is an example of a nature-based solution that would not only provide some environmental improvement, but also helps to abate that hazard. This may look familiar, and it also looks a little different today from this picture, but this is a bioretention facility that we implemented out front of the little store. And so this is giving stormwater a place to go so it can come off of the streets, but then also it is acting as a filter, removing some of the nutrients before it kind of goes back out into the system. So lots of co-benefits when you're using nature-based solutions. And what this all really boils down to is enhancing the local economy, improving your quality of life, and improving public health. And in fact, the economic value of the inland bays report that came out within the last couple of months found that the inland bays support a $4.5 billion per year economy and over 35,000 jobs statewide. That's an impressive number for our little watershed. And why is that? Because it's so gorgeous. Because people want to come here, they want to recreate here, they want to eat our oysters if they're able to. And so without that, you know, we really wouldn't have that number in our report. So, and then also, you know, when people come here, I always picture, you know, they want to wake up and sit on their balcony and look out the bay or look out the ocean and drink their coffee. They want to go on a nature trail and they want to see the birds, you know, and they want to go and sit on the beach, right? So these are the really important assets that we really need to protect. And that's really hitting the last 3 points there. Where I've used a clicker before. And so that's why we incorporated these nature-based solutions into the Dewey Beach Stormwater Master Plan. If you're not familiar, this plan was started in 2016, a partnership between the town and Dewey Beach. It was finished in 2017. We worked with a couple of contractors to basically develop a community-driven phased implementation plan that incorporates innovative stormwater best management practices and also living shoreline designs. And the point of it was to attenuate wave energy, reduce flooding, while also removing nutrients and sediment from Rehoboth Bay, so improving water quality. This is really hard to see, and I do have copies if you're interested, which is also sort of hard to see. This is a map from the plan. It really is best looked at online where you can zoom in, but the study area is the southern portion of Dewey Beach from Salisbury Street down to Bayberry and Palmer. It's an area of about 152 acres, and we split it up into several different drainage basins. And within the study, we looked at the specific drainage basins and determined what best management practices are best suited and where. And we conceptualized those. And so the types of projects include 2 living shorelines, and then a bunch of stormwater retrofits. So bioretention facilities like the Little Store project, and then removing impervious material and replacing that with mulch or porous asphalt or permeable concrete pavers, It also includes updates to some of the stormwater outfalls, and it does include a couple of road width reductions and grading. That last one isn't so much a nature-based solution, but I'll talk a little bit later about why that could still be really beneficial. And so now I think, Danielle, I hope you do this better than me. I keep clicking and I shouldn't do that. I should have learned. So once we decided on the projects, once we conceptualized them, figured out the nutrient reductions and then the cost, we then prioritize the numerous projects. And so we have priority 1, 2, and 3. And the prioritization was done based on nutrient reductions and cost. And so please keep that in mind. You know, this plan does help alleviate flooding, but one of the primary purposes was to reduce nutrient sediment pollution to Rehoboth Bay. Also, please note that it does include costs over here, but this is $2017. I am working with Larry Trout, who developed this plan, to try to update those numbers. We're just having a little bit of difficulty getting something that makes sense for these projects. So those numbers have undoubtedly increased, but it at least gives you some sort of an idea of what we're looking at. So now I'll just go through and briefly explain the different projects that are within the plan. So again, we have your bioretention facility, and there's a few different types of bioretention facilities, but they're all basically the same. You have your soil, you can maybe amend it with some biochar, you have your inflow, you have your outflow under the ground, and you plant it. Or you put some sort of stone or something on top of it. But basically what this does is it gives place for water to go. So it's rushing over all of the impervious sidewalks and roads. It goes into this facility and it sort of just chills out, filters down through the soil. Nutrients are removed from biological processes, and then eventually it makes its way out back into the system. And it's a little bit cleaner, and again, helps to alleviate some flooding. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. One time. Okay, so again, this is Little Store. This is your typical example of a bioretention facility. But I wanted to show you this example also. This is in South Bethany. If you're driving down South Route 1 or up, you'll notice that there's a lot of these types of medians. These are all bioretention facilities. These were completed as part of the Anchorage Canal Pollution and Stormwater Control Plan. And they look really nice. When you look at these projects, so you do have to keep in mind that you're limited to the area you have to work with. So, this might not work in Dewey Beach because the median is much larger. It's just a different sort of environment to be working in. But I just wanted to show you that these bioretention facilities can look different and they can vary in size. So another type of bioretention is called a bump out. This is the concept plan from the Stormwater Master Plan, and this is your sidewalk. And essentially all you do is you bump it out. And so you bump it out and then you put in your bioretention facility. And so here's a better look. I really like this one. So you can see this is the sidewalk, same concepts. You have your inlets, you have your plants, you have your area for it to filter down through, and then you have your outlet. Here is a picture of what this looks like in real life. I found this online in the Chesapeake Quarterly. Same concepts, but it just, this is in a residential area from what I can tell. So, it looks nice, but it's also helping with flooding, and it's also helping with water quality. And then here is one, I pulled this picture because this is probably more of the setting in Dewey Beach. It looks like it's on a busier road with a crosswalk. And again, you're just taking your sidewalk, bumping it out, and then adding in your bioretention facility. This is another concept that's included in the plan, similar to the other bioretention types. you're removing the concrete medians. Sorry, I should have said this is in the median. So you're removing the concrete, and then you're adding in some mulch and then some vegetation, or however you want to do it. But again, the idea is that you're removing that impervious material and then replacing it with pervious material, such as mulch. Also in the plan, we did identify a few areas, mostly the public parking spaces on the side streets, to take out the concrete and replace with porous asphalt. And so those are also in various spots within the study area. We also have some areas identified for permeable concrete pavers. Those are slightly different than asphalt. And those areas are mostly the sort of like recreation areas, where you have your outdoor seating with your patios. And this is going to be fun to look at. So this is just a side. I don't love this graphic, but it just gives you a good side view of what the permeable pavement kind of looks like. You have your area up top that's pervious, and then you have this material and like this area inside where the water can sort of seep down to, but just like the other bioretention facilities, there's room at the bottom for it to move and drain out. And then this is just another graphic of the different layers of what may be involved. This one is showing concrete pavers and then the various materials. It's called like bedding material. And it can change based on like what you're using. But then again, you always have your outfall so that the water can continue to move. And I think I have, yeah. So I wanted to show you this too, because this is like actually what it looks like. I think, we all know what porous asphalt and concrete look like. There are some concrete grid pavers that allow some vegetation to grow up and grow in, and that's just a decision that would have to be made if that's aesthetically what you're interested in. There are the interlocking concrete pavers, which don't allow as much vegetation to grow in, but maybe some. I have never seen this plastic reinforcement grid in real life, but it is another option. It's basically just small rocks that are being held together with a plastic netting. And then you have your natural rock pavers. That is kind of more for like your homes type thing. I wouldn't necessarily be using that in a municipal setting. And before I move on, I do want to say, fun fact, if you don't know, the Center for Inland Bays' parking lot is porous asphalt. And it's actually really amazing to see when it's raining, you see our parking lot, there's no pooling, no flooding. And then right on the other side where there's a larger parking lot for the little park there, it's all flooded. There's little ponds of water, and ours is fine. So it does work. And the maintenance is always a question for a lot of these projects. The maintenance, if we can handle it, everyone else should be able to as a small nonprofit. Basically, you just have to vacuum it once or twice a year. I would say in like a sandier environment like us, you might want to vacuum twice per year. And then you just sort of have to be careful with it. You don't want to be putting a bunch of like mulch or sand or like gravel or anything on top of it, because you don't want to clog it even more. And then, if it does snow a lot and you're, paving, you just have to be careful. There's some standards on the internet about how far up your plow should be. But there's a lot of resources online, and maintenance really isn't that difficult for these for this practice. And so the second to last thing I'll talk about is just road width reduction. So as I mentioned earlier, this isn't necessarily a nature-based solution in and of itself, but by reducing the road widths on it's McKinley, Dagsworthy, and Reed, basically you're just removing some of the impervious surface, and that's opening it up for water when it does fall or when it does come in, just taking some of that away so it has, again, somewhere for it to go. So in and of itself, not a nature-based solution, but it would be really helpful when it comes to stormwater runoff and maybe tidal flooding. So this is I'm almost done with my presentation. This is the last thing I wanted to talk about. As I mentioned, there were 2 living shorelines that were included in the master plan. The first one was Reed Avenue, which we've already completed. And the second one is the Sunset Park living shoreline. I am just going to assume you all know where Sunset Park is. But I wanted to start with this picture because this is showing the change in shoreline over time. So the green is 1992, and you can see, quite a bit of shoreline right there. And then even more so up here, this wouldn't have to be all the way back there. And then the pink is 2006. You can see right away the change. I mean, that's decreased by half. And then 2009, it's not even there anymore. And you've really, really changed come 2009. It's 2015. If you can't see, so 2015 is a silver line, and that's basically kind of where it is present day. So you've lost all of this here, you've lost all of this up there and this, and I mean, if you drive down to this road, you know that it just ends into the bay. And so this project has been a priority for the center and for the town for several years. We've applied to several grants to fund the implementation of this project that have been unsuccessful. And because of that, the center still really values this project, and the town also values this project. And so the center, are going to dedicate some of our BIL, the bipartisan infrastructure law funding that we are getting as a national estuary program, to this project. The first phase, which will kick off as soon as we get approval from EPA, will be to do the final design and the permitting, and then the next year will be implementation. And this is the concept design from the original plan, so this may change, but this is just the initial concept. It shouldn't, the general idea behind it won't change. We want to protect all of the shoreline. Here we have an oyster reef, shell bags, which would allow for some sedimentation to occur back here, which would build up the shoreline. And then we would have another type of structure somewhere out further that would again just help to attenuate some of that wave energy. We have also this is again an older concept design that we will look to update, but this is the marsh area right at the end of McKinley. And we want to continue to protect this marsh from any further degradation. But what we really want to do is to rechannelize that marsh so that it's functioning the way it should. And then we want to add a stormwater BMP. I don't know what that would look like right now, but just some other stormwater BMP that would help with flooding on McKinley, and then just help the whole process of water moving from McKinley into the marsh. And so again, we'll start with final planning once we get the go. And this will still probably take a couple of years to actually get constructed and completed. I had to just quickly go over what nature-based solutions are and then talk a little bit about the plan. I will entertain any questions. Yes, Dale?
Yeah, as I understand it, and I believe it's a 5-year plan from now for DNREC. To previously or ahead of time for the 2 committees we have, the climate, work out the plans and prioritize for that area. DelDOT, so that we get those improvements done.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that right? I mean,
yeah, absolutely. And so we have already engaged DelDOT. Well, at least I've been talking to Jim Pappas about this project, and so they're keyed in at least to this one. And then they are doing the SR1 resiliency study, and I'm hoping that timeline sort of aligns with the planning and then implementation of this project, because they'll be coming through and I don't know what their end really is, but they will be doing that study, and hopefully it somewhat aligns. But we will be working with DelDOT for sure.
you know, you're forced to have it aligned.
Oh, yes, for these other projects.
For the highway project.
Yes, yes, I'm sorry. I was like thinking about Sunset Park.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, yes, definitely. For any of these other projects, especially the median projects, we would have to do that in partnership with DelDOT and whatever their timeline is. Or they would, yeah, we'd have to just get agreement from them that they would not tear up anything.
And one question about all municipalities are, but is it, if they had their wish list and if they had plenty of money, viable to to sculpt out the bay and put the spoils along the shoreline?
So, so there's a lot of factors that go into dredging, and I can't answer that from the state's point of view. I can't answer that from the state's point of view. I'm not sure. You'd have to look at the type of soil that you are dredging and if it would be a match for that shoreline. But I'm not even sure, you know, the other areas that they're looking at for dredging. I'm not sure.
Because I know they're reusing spoils out there.
Yeah, they are doing one dredging project, White's Creek, I think it is, and they're going to be using that, from my understanding, for a project in Millsboro, a wetland creation project. So it's possible. I'm not sure. That's something that we could always look at during the planning phase when we do the final design, because we'll have to do a 30% design, 60%, 90%, and then final. So throughout that process, we can engage the state and see if they have any plans for future dredging.
But as far as the main highway is concerned, now going back to that, then it would behoove these two committees.
So, I mean, similar to how we tried to partner on the median project with Mark Lutz and his team in DelDOT, I think you would want to do a similar process where you're engaging DelDOT along with the implementation and to see how it can overlap.
Like the,
Certainly save a lot of money.
Yeah, definitely. Well, absolutely, because if DelDOT's bringing in their resources.
like any bioretention street side areas like the ones you showed, those kinds of things could be coupled with the resurfacing and done at the same time. I had a couple of questions about those. With those, I know there's a substrate underneath that you have to, set up. You have to have outflows as well on those? The street side as well?
The outflow would be underground.
Okay. So
And I'm not an engineer, so I don't know specifically, but
okay.
sorry.
With the pervious pavers approach, I'll ask you, Bill, is that the kind of thing that in planning and zoning would get involved with any new applications for, outside seating areas, things of that nature, to encourage the use of those kinds of materials? Is that we would talk to planning and zoning about encouraging that kind of thing?
I think it would be recommended to the commissioners from one of the committees, and then the commissioners would then pass it to planning and zoning.
But that would be the right place for it to be handled in planning and zoning. When people put in a new permit to do something like that, that they would encourage them to take that extra step and use pervious surface stuff, right? Okay, that makes sense. All right. One more thing, please. Can you put up that last slide that you had just for a second?
Yes. Right through it.
Dave, this one?
So what's the status of the funding for that?
We will look to use our BIL funding as well.
Oh, you will?
So
That's-
it'll be, I'm sorry, I should have included, there's another picture that shows the whole scope, but the idea is that we will make this it might be a phased project because it'll be a much larger project at that point, but the idea is to look at both Sunset Park and this marsh as one.
Okay.
And we would use our BIL funding to do the planning and then implementation. And again, implementation will probably have to be phased.
Right.
But
What do you call this part of the project? Do you have a name?
we've been calling it the Lions Club Marsh
Lions Club
with
Marsh.
Thin House.
Good. Thank you, Michelle. Any further questions? Anyone on Zoom or in public comment?
Hi, this is Stacy. I'm Stacy Hanna. I'm on the committee. I just wanted, you mentioned on the Sunset Park Living Shoreline that you're waiting for EPA to approve the project. Understanding everything takes time. Can you tell us what timeline you're expecting that to be approved?
Definitely. So you're right that the timeline is always sort of moving with EPA, but they do have our work plan. We've already gone back and forth to do some editing, and we should be hearing by the end of December, we should be hearing if we have approval. And then once we can get that approval. So I would say by the first of the year, we'll be looking at really starting to work on this.
Awesome. Thank you.
I have a question. You talked about the Lions Club Marsh. My understanding is it's privately owned. How would you work with that?
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. So we would have to get landowner permission in order to do any sort of work within that. We could maybe do some of the offshore work, maybe, but yeah, I mean, to do any of the rechannelization, yeah, we would have to get landowner approval. So that might be one of the first things we try to do is make contact. I always forget it's not actually the Lions Club.
I will.
Any other questions for Michelle?
Project, is there some sort of time horizon?
Yes, so the engineer, whoever we work with, will definitely look at the different scenarios, and they'll design it based off of the scenario that the town just chooses. So whether that's 100-year flood or whatever, that would be part of the planning process.
What's the current design now?
I'm not sure. I can maybe go back and look. I'm not sure though.
You said that stormwater management prioritization is based on total nutrient reduction. Flood reduction and total nutrient reduction.
I'm sure there's a way. The we would just have to rework the weighting of the different variables. We would probably want to re-engage Larry Trout, who did this initially. He's no longer with RK&K, but he's with Strawn Environmental, and so we could always ask him and see if it's possible. I think it would just be tinkering with the mathematics behind it.
They actually did do a score on the flooding benefits. It's actually in the graph. Depending on the project, they gave it a score. You could always use that.
Questions for Michelle? Michelle, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Danielle, did we agree that you would go next, or was it Jennifer? Jennifer, please.
I have two presentations for you guys, pre, post fill, and flood ready.
Might be flood ready.
Myself, I'm Jennifer Pongratz. I'm with Denrex Division of Watershed Stewardship. I'm also a certified floodplain manager, and I'm actually here for David Warga. He was the one who actually did this, put this presentation together, but he couldn't make it today, so I'm just doing it for him. So if you have any questions, I will do my best to answer them, but if I can't answer it, I'll be sure to take it back to him and see if he can answer it for you. And we'll see if this remote is aimed this way. Oh, okay. So today I'm going to go over a few things. One is what the National Flood Insurance Program is, what flood management means, what higher standards are, and how they can affect your community. I'll talk a little bit about flood insurance and how it's rated by risk, what flood hazard mitigation is basically, and some floodplain mapping, and I'll introduce you to our Delaware flood planning tool if you are not already familiar with it. So the National Flood Insurance Program was established in 1968. It offers federal flood insurance to policyholders within communities that are participants in the National Flood Insurance Program. And as part of that deal, the communities have to have a minimum standard floodplain ordinance that they have to follow, and they have to enforce those flood regulations. It is managed by FEMA, and it's been reauthorized to December 16th of 2022. So we're kind of getting close to the end of that timeline. So hopefully it'll be reauthorized again before that date hits. But it was originally in July, I think it was supposed to end, and then they extended it to December. So here we are. And the program is currently over $20 billion in debt. That number was last updated on November 4th. And I imagine that since Hurricane Ian, there's been more claims that have been submitted or are going to be processed that don't even touch that number yet. So, I mean, that was a $50 to $65 billion disaster. So we'll see. Floodplain management, it lowers the cost of flood insurance. It reduces flood damage and flood risk. It creates more resilient communities. It decreases the recovery time after disasters. There is enforcement of floodplain regulations with floodplain management. And if you're in the NFIP, it definitely avoids you being put on probation, which would put your availability of flood insurance at risk if you were in that situation. So one of the things in floodplain management is the adoption of flood insurance or flood regulations. And you have to go by the minimum that the federal Code of Regulations has. However, communities can add additional regulations to that, so higher standards. And we'll get to what some of those higher standards are. And Dewey Beach is a community that participates in the National Flood Insurance Program and does have a couple higher standards. So we'll go over those. Yes, so and as I said before, not only do you have to adopt the flood regulations, but you also have to make sure you're enforcing them. And that's a lot of record keeping, that's putting it into your building code, making sure those building codes are followed, having records of permitting, elevation certificates, things like that. They do have the ability to adopt the higher standards. You'll find a common theme where we mention higher standards over and over again in this presentation. And FEMA is actually considering updating their minimum requirements to make them a little bit more, to help with flood reduction and flood damage reduction, basically. So Delaware did create a model floodplain ordinance that communities can base their ordinances off of. We have a couple versions. One is for just flood zone A, which is mostly like riverine type flooding and that sort of thing. And then there's another one that has coastal area flooding, coastal zones like V zones and coastal A zones. It's written in regulatory language and includes language for all types of development and allows the option for higher standards. So what are higher standards? So as I said before, the NFIP requires a minimum amount of standards that you have to put into your floodplain ordinance. Communities can exceed those standards, and usually communities are more knowledgeable about what the flood risks are in their communities, so they can tailor their regulations to those risks so that you can minimize them moving forward. And Dewey Beach has a freeboard in their regulations, which is a higher standard. And we'll talk about freeboard in a minute. Also, if communities are participating in the NFIP, they also can participate in the community rating system. The community rating system will give you credits for having higher standards and outreach and record keeping and that sort of thing. And if you have a certain rating within the CRS, it gives you a certain discount to the policyholders in your community, the community as a whole. So why should you incorporate higher standards? It reduces risk of human life, reduces risk of damage to personal property. It reduces damage to infrastructure and public property. It reduces costs for flood insurance premiums, for damage claims, for repair costs, and for less lost revenue. And it reduces hardship. If you avoid having something happen, flood damage happen, then you don't necessarily have displaced families. Your businesses aren't shut down as long, those sort of things. So what are some types of higher standards? The first one I mentioned already is freeboard. Dewey Beach has a 12-inch freeboard requirement. There's also cumulative substantial damage, substantial improvement. If a structure is substantially damaged or is to be substantially improved, it has to be brought into current compliance with flood regulations. If this, I guess, substantial improvement or substantial damage isn't all done at once, then somebody can just kind of piecemeal their improvements to the structure without bringing the whole thing into compliance. Sometimes if you put a cumulative clause, it says that if you exceed that 50% rule, the substantial damage or substantial improvement over a 5-year period or a 10-year period, then you do have to bring the structure into full compliance. Accessibility, elevating your roads so that they don't flood as often, so that you can get emergency vehicles, so you can evacuate people, those sort of things. That would be one thing that could be considered a higher standard, that if you're putting in a new road, that you have it at a certain elevation. There's also a floodway setback requirement and flood elevation rise, but these things don't really pertain to Dewey Beach because, again, all the floodplains in Dewey are coastal. And also you can recognize coastal A zones as far as doing with your minimum standards. You can actually put higher standards in your coastal A zones to resist storm damage by maybe making them more like the V zone. So in a V zone, you have velocity. You have waves that are moving through the area during a 100-year storm. And then there's a line, and then there's A zone. Well, the storm doesn't really know where that line is. So if you put those higher standards in the coastal A zones, you might have that wave action, but you might be built so that you can handle it. So freeboard, like I said, I would talk more about it, but basically that's taking the base flood elevation. So your flood insurance rate maps have a base flood elevation for certain areas. If your community adopts freeboard, which can be any amount of space above that base flood elevation, that causes everything to be constructed at a higher level. If it's at a higher level, the higher you go, the lower your flood insurance is going to be. So right away you get a cost savings as far as your flood insurance. It also lowers your risk. Again, with that wave action or those flood heights, if you're higher, there's less chance you're going to have damage. This way, right? Okay, so here's an example of where a freeboard has benefited somebody. The house that's on the right was elevated a little higher than the standard. The house to the left was probably sitting wherever it needed to be when it was constructed, and it definitely suffered some more damage. Okay, and then coastal A zones. In coastal A zones, we also have what we call a limit of moderate wave action. You can make this a regulatory line. It's not by FEMA standards, but communities are allowed to do that as far as construction standards. If you want to say anything seaward of that line, then has to have more stringent regulations, like it has to be on a piling or column foundation, that you have to be free from obstruction or have breakaway walls below the base flood elevation, those sort of things. It can reduce the amount of damage that you have during a severe storm. And then this kind of gives you an idea of how that's mapped out, like where you're closest to the water body that has that wave action, you're going to be in a V zone where you can expect up to 3 feet or 3 feet or greater wave action during a storm. In the coastal A zone, you get 1.5 to 3 feet wave action or wave height action. And then in the A zone, you'll have up to 1.5 feet. So again, you can still have 1.5 feet of wave action, or at least it's predicted. It doesn't mean whether that's going to happen or not, but it's predicted that you could possibly have that much wave action. So having that higher standard could reduce damage. I know. Okay, so flood insurance. Flood insurance, federal flood insurance is available to anyone, any policyholder that is in a community that participates in the National Flood Insurance Program. There are 23,000 participating communities in the United States. Homes and businesses that are in high flood risk areas that are that have a federally backed mortgage are required to have federal flood insurance or have flood insurance, period. And then also, if you are in a flood or in a NFIP community, you can get flood insurance, even if you're not in a special flood hazard area. And floods can happen anywhere. If it rains, it can flood. And just 1 inch of flood water can cause up to $25,000 in damage. And flood insurance rates or premiums were rated since the 1970s on a certain amount of criteria, like the amount and type of coverage that was being purchased, where your property is on a flood insurance rate map, how old the house is and how it's designed, and how elevated your building is in relation to the base flood elevation. But that all changed with risk rating 2.0, which, oh, I went too fast. Oh. Okay. It came into effect on October, and I skipped over anyway. I'll just read it to you. Came into effect October 1st in 2022. So now all policies are now rated in a different way, not the way that they used to be. And it started with new and existing policy holders who were eligible for renewal of their policy. And then on April 1st, 2022, all remaining policies now are rated with the risk rating 2.0. And so now you are rated based on what your ground elevation is to the surrounding area. Are you on the lowest part of like a watershed, or are you on the highest part of a watershed? Your distance to a water source. How close are you to the ocean? How close are you to the bay? And how large is that body of water? And what type is it? Does it have wave action or does it have less wave action? The building characteristics, like where your first floor height is, what kind of foundation are you on, and who's occupying your building? Also, the cost of how much it's going to cost to rebuild your structures and ensure its contents comes into play when they're determining how much your rates are going to be. They're no longer using flood insurance rate maps or elevation certificates to determine what your flood insurance policy will be like. Those are still used for regulatory purposes, though. We still use flood insurance rate maps to determine how you build in a floodplain, and we use the elevation certificates to determine your compliance. So basically, policies represent the risk and not the average of the community. The Delawareans, they're in Delaware. There's about 26,100 policies in force. It's estimated that 363,000 properties are not covered by an NFIP insurance policy. The average claim payout in the last 10 years has been $11,700. With risk rating 2.0, about 38 policies were estimated to receive an immediate decrease, so they were paying too much for their risk. 52% of policies were estimated to increase up to $120 per year. 8% were estimated to increase between $120 and $240 per year. And 2% of policies were estimated to increase greater than $20 per month on average. Nice, good one. But more than 20% of all NFIP claims come from outside the areas of the highest risk. So even though you're not in the worst areas, you can still flood. So hazard mitigation is a sustainable action that reduces or eliminates long-term risk to people and property from future disasters. We'll go over some ways to mitigate. One way is to do projects, and you can get grants to do that. Some of them are competitive, some of them are not, but this is really outside my wheelhouse. I'm very unfamiliar with what hazard mitigation grants are out there. So if you have any questions about that, probably better to ask David. But I have been seeing a lot about this grant assistance program that David mentioned earlier. And I highly also recommended tapping into that resource if you have questions about obtaining grants for mitigation. Okay, so some mitigation strategies that you could look into is the installation of engineered flood vents, elevating structures, relocating structures, buying out repetitive loss properties and removing those structures and turning those into areas that can handle and maybe abate flood. Local adoption of hazard resistant building codes. That's where those higher standards come back in again. And participation in the CRS program, because some of the mitigation things that you might do will give you credits in that CRS program or the community ratings system, which will help lower your flood insurance rates. So just to show you a couple of these. Engineered flood vents, basically by retrofitting old vents with these vents, because they are more effective, will possibly give you credits towards your community rating system. Elevating structures, here's an example of one that was elevated in Fenwick Island. Relocating structures, this is a house in Big Stone Beach that we not only had elevated, but also moved it landward. There's like a little lawn lighthouse that you can kind of see in relation to where the house used to be to where it is, well, where it was when they moved it. So moving it further away from the Delaware Bay in this case too. And then buyouts, which actually it skipped a slide, but we had a repetitive loss property in Bowers Beach that they submitted enough claims that they were able to get a grant to buy out the land. And I think it was the town of Bowers that actually bought the property, and then they turned it into a little park with bocce ball courts and that sort of thing. So now if it floods, the bocce ball courts might flood, but then they eventually dry out and then they can use it again. Okay, building codes, basically, there's a study that's been done that says that building codes can save. I think they save lives, they save money, they save property damage during flooding events. So it's always good to have your building codes updated. And then the community rating system, it's a voluntary program that communities can enter into. It can, you earn credit for the things that you do, and they're based on 4 categories. That's public information, so like outreach, informing those of their flood risk, mapping and regulations, making sure your maps are accurate and your regulations have higher standards and that sort of thing, and that your regulations also are up to date with the minimum. Flood damage reduction, anything that you can do to minimize flood damage. And then warning response. If you have ways of warning residents of their risks and like maybe early warning systems and stuff like that before storms and that response time. And then the town of Dewey Beach is in the CRS and has a rating of 9, which gives everyone that has federal flood insurance a 5% discount. Onto our flood planning tool. So this is our online mapping system that shows the FEMA flood maps, among other things. The purpose of it is enable viewing of the flood maps with a few other layers that you can use that are kind of useful. But basically, all you do is enter an address or a tax parcel number into the box at the top. It'll zoom in to the property. We used our Lewis office here for an example. Which is definitely in a floodplain. If you click on a structure or a point on the map, you'll get this pop up that'll tell you where that point is, what flood zone that's in. If you click the more details in this box, the more details will tell you every floodplain that's in that, on that parcel. So if you have a large parcel, you might have multiple floodplains. Or if you click on a point and it says you're not in the floodplain, there still might be part of the property that is. So it's kind of good to look at their more details. It has several layers. One of them is our building restriction line. So that's really where I am most of the time, is doing coastal construction regulations. And so that's our building restriction line, the red line that's on there. You can pull that up. You can pull up sea level rise inundation from 1 feet to 7 feet to see how that would affect your property. It also will show the limb wall line. So again, if communities are thinking about putting that into their floodplain ordinance, they can see where that line is and how it would affect them. And then there's also, well, obviously the flood maps. And then if there's like a letter of map amendment or a letter of map revision, you can pull that up and that sort of thing. Also, if you're an engineer and you're looking for a hydraulic model, you can find those on here as well. And that is the web address for it. The other option it has is to print out, like when you do zoom in on a property, you can print this out. It's a very useful tool when you are sharing it with your constituents and so on. So then I just have a few key takeaways before I'm done. But basically, you can educate your residents on the risk. We have tools available. There's also, FEMA has some tools as well. We're not the only ones that do. Encourage flood insurance, even outside the special flood hazard area. Where it rains, it floods. Flood insurance is not the only solution. Adopting higher standards reduces much risk and insurance rates. Building floors with 18 inches above the base flood elevation is far less likely to be damaged. So a foot is good, 18 inches could be better. Discourage construction and fill in the flood fringe. You don't really have flood fringe here, again, because that's more like along rivers and tributaries, where here we're more coastal. Locate critical facilities outside of high-risk areas. Discourage development in the floodplain if you can. It's difficult here in town. And mitigate known issues. And then this is FEMA's official floodsmart.gov, their official website. You can find insurance agents who handle federal flood insurance on here. And then there's a wealth of other resources as well. Well, I think I have, yeah. And so I also put David's contact information up here because, again, he is the state floodplain coordinator for Delaware. And so he is much more knowledgeable in a lot of this stuff than I am, but I knew enough to be dangerous, I guess. Any questions?
I have one, I don't know if you can answer or not. I get asked a lot about FEMA buying or helping people raise their homes, but I've been told when they do that, some of the property owners give up some of their rights. Are you familiar with that program?
I am not. The buyout would probably come through a grant.
Right.
I don't know exactly what they would be giving up.
I think he's talking about two different things.
Yeah.
He's talking about raising versus you talking about
A
buying.
buyout. Yeah. So with the buyout, usually when that happens, there is something that goes into the deed that says it can't be developed again for certain reasons.
This is for raising.
But just for raising structures, I don't know of anything that you would be giving up, but that's probably a better question for somebody else.
Okay, all right.
But I'll jot it down and I'll have David get back to you.
You know, that based on your existing building codes, but that wouldn't be something you're.
We'll do it a little more, thanks.
Yeah. And there is a 90-10 subsidy for raising that we'd heard, and I forget which agency helps with that, but
It's all gonna be FEMA, so.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, if you're identified as a disadvantaged community
Yeah.
or.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank
you.
Joseph, did you have just a couple? Oh, Dave?
I had a question. The what if document or calculation as to how a change in its CRS rating would translate into dollars?
So But how many credits do you need to get a certain discount?
That's the scoring
Right,
end of
that
it.
would be the score, and
This is where a particular municipality that has a certain score,
okay,
they take into account, and I've heard that in Dewey Beach, there's somewhere around 1,119 properties, federal flood insurance. And it calculates what that change in premium would be, up or down,
okay,
hopefully up, to a different CRS rating.
right, okay.
So that if it were to go from a 9 to an 8, from 9, from a 5% to a 10%,
Right.
dollars is that in total
So you're talking
for
about,
all the people having policies in the town.
right, so you're talking about like a guidance document that would help you get from.
It would be a policy and planning document. Want to know that number, I would think,
Okay,
because it tells you how important it is.
right,
But then the other thing that I'm concerned about is that there are properties that have, either as an alternative to or in addition to the federal participation in the program, private insurance, typically with higher limits.
Mhm.
And my thinking is, gee, if I were a private insurance company and somebody came and they wanted to get flood insurance, one of the first questions I would want to know is, well, what kind of CRS rate, where are you? What is the CRS rating that you get, as a way of trying to reckon and underwrite what the
right.
risk and the premium would be for that policy. So my concern is that once you get that what-if translation of the rating into the dollars, that only tells you about existing participants in that jurisdiction,
Mhm.
but it doesn't tell you what the secondary is on the private market. It's, I would think, got to be out there.
David, if I could make a suggestion, why don't you commit that to writing and send it along to us, and we'll forward it to Dave Wargo, see if he can answer those
Okay,
questions.
is there going to be a transcript made of, or?
It's all been recorded.
Yeah, the recording of what I said.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
That would be
That's great.
the mechanism.
Joseph, do you have a couple slides you just wanted to
Sure.
quickly add to this?
Yeah,
Joseph Ferris.
yeah, I'm an engineer with Denver. Jennifer, and I can speak to some of the questions that have been answered. I had probably over a decade in the private sector. Looking at designing for sea level rise, I did a lot of work for the city of New York that rise in new construction. And if you've ever looked at the sea level rise curve, they're all over the map, right? So designing for a future condition at 21. Advise is that map out all the hazards and the potential. Recommend designing with something with a foundation built up in a depth as sea level rise. As long as you plan ahead, you don't have to, for the future, you plan with as the future. One strategy I think is the most. And then to dredging, our dredging program is targeted. The reason why we dredge is to maintain. That's why we dredge, and that's what we recommend. We always try to find a beneficial material instead of putting it upland in CDF. We try to elevate a marsh platform or restore a beach. The reason we dredge is for navigation. Enhancing resiliency, but if we had the capacity and money wasn't a problem, dredge is not necessarily what our program is designed for at the moment. So I have a few slides that kind of look at some success in terms of coastal resiliency, namely beach nourishment. Anyone who's been around for more than 20 years in Dewey, Rehoboth, and Delaware beaches and can recall back before 2005, 2003, 2004, 2005 when the first nourishment, federal nourishment job constructed. We're in kind of a new paradigm now. Our baseline is completely different along the ocean coast. The picture I have of these aerials are from Google Earth, and I use Surf Avenue in Rehoboth, and I use that because as a teenager, I was used to driving around there, and the ocean is at the road, right? Since 2005, there's a beach and a dune in front of that. We're looking at a completely different baseline for our ocean coast from a coastal hazard perspective. So that's speaking to what beach nourishment can do for you from a coastal resilience station. But here's another example. So this is a hotel at the end of ocean end of McKinley Street. I'm not sure when this photo was taken, but this would have been pre a federal nourishment job. 4 minutes literally in the ocean. There we go. So, and then here's before the federal nourishment job, when the tides are low, there's a little bit of a beach in front of that hotel. Not much of a dune, really no dune, because it's kind of, the hotel is actually really on the beach if you're really looking at it. Then after the nourishment job, you can see that vegetation, that's a dune that's in front of that hotel. So we're talking a completely different baseline along our ocean coast, which is a good thing, in my opinion. I'm trying not to go trigger happy on this because I've seen what can happen. Okay, yeah. When you see me clicking, then or I'll do one of these. So this is kind of maybe a little difficult to read, but a point that I like to make is even after major storms, since the federal job, the beach is much wider in volume, more voluminous than a normal beach before any federal job. So the blue line shows what the current beach profile looks like. The black line is after a nor'easter that would have been Nor-Ida. I forget what the year was, 2007, 8, somewhere around there. That little spike there that's just a survey bus, so ignore that little jagged thing that's shooting down there. And then that dashed red line is the 1999 beach profile. So you're looking at a shoreline advancement at the high tide line of 190 feet. So that's pretty significant. And this is kind of the beach fill. This is the 2022 beach fill plan view, which will be constructed this coming year and next year. So it extends from the town limit with Indian Beach all the way to, I think that's Salisbury Street, where Sweet Street. Yeah. So that's where the taper section ends. I think that's consistent from year to year. I don't think there's much change in that between jobs. Next slide. And then this is the profile. It's really difficult to read, but this, I'm going to give you a quick lessons in datums. So something that I've found useful in communicating flood hazards and having people understand flood hazards. When you look at a base flood elevation, that datum is NABD 88. So it's a datum that's understood for engineers and surveyors across the nation as a common reference point. So when I'm talking to communities, I convert that to what that is relative to mean high water. So if you have, in this case, mean high water is 1.6 feet above NABD. So if the flood elevation's 4.6 feet, then that means it's 3 foot higher than your regular high tide. So I think that's easier to digest and to conceive, because sometimes when people read a flood map, they look, it's 10, does this mean it's 10 feet deep here? What does that mean? So I think that's like an important thing to understand. And if you're reading a flood map, understand that. And if you're communicating that with others, I think that's a better way to communicate the the flood hazard. And the reason why we don't use that as our baseline is because high tide here is different than, way different than Slaughter Beach, way different than Pickering Beach. So we need that common reference point that isn't really grounded in something that people can really grab their hand. So it's a high tide is 1.6. The design berm elevation, the flat part of the beach, is 7.2. So that's what, 5.5 feet higher. And then the elevation of the dune crest is 13.2 feet NAVD. The design documents from the early 2000s was 14 feet NGVD, which is an old datum that's transferred. So that's why there's these weird decimal points on the design element. So the dune crest is 5 foot higher than the beach level, and the beach level is about 5 foot higher than the high tide level. Next slide. Just a depiction that it's pretty easy to adapt a ocean beach to sea level rise. We can literally, if the high tide shifts up by a foot, we can just shift everything up and over so that the landward limit stays at the same point, and we can fill that volume so that the elevation of the beach and the dune relative to the water levels are the same under different sea level rise conditions. So the ocean coast, from a construction, engineering, design, building standpoint, is very easy to deal with. What's challenging, of course, is the resources, right? We don't have unlimited financial resources and not necessarily unlimited sand resources. That being said, one thing that we're trying to draw our attention to, and what's really important for the future of nourishment, is what we call regional sediment management. So the sand that we're putting on our beach is not disappearing. It doesn't go into an alternative universe. If it does, I want a wormhole. I want to check it out, but it might be easier to get to, actually, because so what happens is the sand ends up in shoals or other areas, so which can be a challenge for us. So if you don't act soon enough, when sand washes into a shoal and it becomes emergent, our regulations, it becomes a bird habitat that you can't harvest. So time is of the essence when we're looking at these things. And to your question about dredging and filling and that sort of thing, so dredging certain areas becomes difficult the longer you wait, because the more it grows, it becomes habitat. An example of Seal Island in Fenwick Island area. It was an emergent island with marsh grasses. Certain sections is submerged, and now it has submerged aquatic vegetation. And they were considering restoring that, but you can't fill over SAV. So it's kind of like, what's your baseline for your ecosystem? So some of our regulations and rules and environmental hinder us on doing what might be best overall. So it's that's the challenge. We kind of set up hurdles in our own way, I think. So I lied. I think I'll end with continuing my philosophical viewpoint is just generally speaking, we're great at adapting. What we really need to be good, what we really need to do is stay disciplined and focus on the real solutions, and make sure our elected officials are focused on real solutions, not something that makes people feel good, like, you know, closing a farm which starves people because you're going to reduce CO2 by some fraction of some percent that's going to, you know, be wiped out by the uncertainty of a climate model, when you can build permeable roads or do other things. So keeping our elected official honest is crucial for a state like Delaware, where financial resources and other resources are very limited. So making sure we're using our dollars the best way is very, very important. And then globally, from a global perspective, economic prosperity is resiliency. So the fact that we're able to think about this is a luxury. So in areas that are really, really vulnerable, they can't even plan for this, right? So so the more prosperity we have, the more resiliency. So those are just two philosophical things.
Any questions for Joseph?
.25 elevation of the dune.
Yeah.
is really not adequate to ward off the effects of an authentic hurricane,
Right.
even category 2, for example. And that the 13.25 height is the result of the Corps of Engineers benefit cost evaluation.
Exactly where they arrived at that elevation. It is based on the 2003, 2004 agreement. That's our 50-year agreement that we're doing these projects over. That describes the design basis of the berm width, the elevations, and that's where it was 14-foot NGVD, which converts down to 13.2. Was it a cost-benefit analysis potentially? And in terms of what level of storm protection, I'm not sure of this return intervals, but since the field job, I mean, it's we were talking about kind of the recreational accessibility, not damage to infrastructure. So we're talking about different things when we have storms. So even if it's not going to, you know, maybe the big one might take it out, but it would have been worse if not. So it might not. It's probably a trade-off, right? You can only go so big and equitable across the Atlantic coast. Jersey has some variability, but that's pretty much elevation based on the design documents.
Okay, so this 2000 agreement runs between the Corps of Engineers and DENREC, or who are the parties to the
I think
agreement?
it's either the
Okay. And I mean, I'd love to get by email, if I could, those diagrams that you had for the SLR adaptation and the 2022 beach spill plan review. I mean, I couldn't really see it from this distance. Calculations myself.
Can I suggest that you guys do a sidebar after the meeting?
Absolutely.
Okay,
I'll give you
but I just have one
Yeah, sure.
lead up. My concern is that on top of the Corps of Engineers standard as we now have it,
Right.
you have the stovepipe ideas, as I have come to understand it,
Right.
speaking to Tony Pratt, of what FEMA requires, and which gets into the 540 rule,
Okay,
Yeah.
guys, okay,
Yeah.
which still has vitality.
let me ask you to take this offline, because we have to move on.
Okay,
Please.
so that's what I'm trying to get to, is what would client with the
Right.
FEMA 540 rule
Dave?
that would enable a change of the flood maps?
Yeah, there's a lot to that too, because that dune also has to be considered well-established and vegetated, so it's not as, so there's a lot.
That's what I've heard, is that
Okay, guys, please.
completely natural may not, because it's only sand.
I'm with DENREC, and I'm an engineer and shoreline waterway manager.
What's your name again?
Joe Berry. I'm not on the agenda. Is
No,
that the
no.
case?
We added him at the last minute, a few
Yeah, sorry, I was
slides in
I was
addition
a
to.
late entry, so
yeah.
I'm sorry about that.
Yep.
How do you spell that?
FARIES. I don't have a card, but I can write down our email address and put it
Okay.
somewhere.
Thank you, Joe.
Absolutely.
All right, moving on, last but not least, far from least, we have Danielle Swallow, my new best friend.
I'll help you, Jim.
Ask if you could just advance the slides. Okay. Thanks, everyone. I'm really happy to be here, and if you need to stretch, by all means, go and stretch. We've had a lot of good presentations. I'm Danielle Swallow with Delaware Sea Grant, based at UD. And if you can go to the next slide real quickly, my background's in urban environmental planning. And I've been with Sea Grant 5 years. I have a long career in ocean and coastal kinds of planning topics. And I'm also affiliated with Rascal. Our as are Jen and Michelle. So I'm glad some of you were able to come to our summit. Next slide. So we heard a lot of good information about the stormwater side of things and the work that CIB is doing, including some projects that already been identified that the community can run with if they want to, right? I know Dave mentioned some interest in grants, and so you have some projects you could probably start running with, and CIB certainly stepping up and helping. And then you heard about the regulatory framework, for floodplain management. I'm going to talk a little bit more from like a 10,000 foot level and really try to walk you through some overall resiliency planning approaches that can really help the community in the long term continue beyond one or two of those projects and really anticipate more of the climate changes that are coming. So quickly, just to make sure we hear resilience a lot, just to make sure we all are on the same page. Resilience is the ability to bounce back after a disruptive event, which could include, a nor'easter or some sort of climate event. And I think fundamentally it's trying to reduce the intensity of the impact, but also trying to minimize the time it takes for life to return to normal. And it doesn't have to be as normal as it was the day before, but that you regain your basic operations from a town perspective, or basic ecological functions from a nature perspective, or your basic quality of life considerations like shelter and food, from a human perspective. And in Wilmington, they had a major flood from the remnants of Ida in 2021. And there's folks there that are still displaced without housing. So they've taken quite a long time to return to normal. And some of that's because there's a lack of affordable housing, and maybe some of the emergency, recovery aspects weren't well planned for. So that really impacts the resilience of a community. It's something that all of us need to think about. Next slide. And I just throw this slide up just to kind of reiterate the point that resiliency oftentimes is a lot about minimizing the length of time that it takes for something to recover and bounce back. So if you have an infrastructure, like in example B, that is not well maintained, like a roadway, maybe the surface needs repaving, and it hasn't been well maintained, that may take longer to recover. If you have a major flood event, it may be out, like Route 1 could potentially be out longer. But if you have elevated that road, and if you're maintaining the road system very well, then the length of disruption would be shorter. That's kind of the concept. And this applies also to our social systems and our natural systems. Next slide. So this is a point I just really want to emphasize. For communities like Dewey Beach, you're in a hard situation because you've got the ocean and the bay. You've got water squeezing you on all sides. You've got water coming up in the water table below you. It's just absolutely fundamental, and this is my professional opinion, that communities like Dewey begin to make resiliency a common thread throughout all of your planning. So not just the infrastructure planning, but also your social planning. Who are the residents in your community that might be hardest impacted by flooding, for example, or just a storm like wind and other things? You have an aging community, for example, right? So we know that some folks that are older may be disproportionately impacted. That's just, we saw that in COVID, we see that in hurricanes and so forth. How are we uniquely planning for their needs? Emergency preparedness, how are we anticipating how to keep city functions, like the core functions, operating when there's a disruption? I think most of your city facilities are in a floodplain. So how can you build in redundancy? How can you educate your citizens to take evacuation seriously? Look what happened with Hurricane Ian in Florida. We had, a lot of residents that didn't evacuate, and they, I think, regret that. There was a lot of rescues that had to take place, and there were unfortunately many deaths. So it's really weaving resiliency principles throughout all these things. Next slide. And then fundamentally, it's understanding risk. And you'd be surprised just how not well understood risk is from basic concepts. So I'm going to review some of that. And it starts with knowing your hazard. And of course, we're talking about flooding, right? And flooding can occur from different sources. Next slide. And we can start with heavy precipitation events, which are just those heavy rainfalls. It could be just a thunderstorm, not necessarily tied to a nor'easter or hurricane. In Delaware, we've seen something like 3.6 inches of an increase in precipitation over the last 100 years. But going forward, climate projections indicate that we'll continue to see some increase, but really we'll see particularly an increase in rainfall intensity. More rain dropping over a shorter period of time, which can overwhelm our stormwater drains, for example. Next slide. You know about coastal storms, right? So the nor'easters, the tropical systems. I just would like to emphasize that, in Delaware, I hear residents all the time, like we take for granted that we haven't had a lot of direct hits. But it doesn't take direct hits for us to feel the impacts. This is a photo from South Bethany in 2019 from subtropical storm Melissa. It was way offshore. It never made landfall. It doesn't matter, right? The winds were a certain direction. There was, the storm hovered offshore over successive tides, and the bay waters built up, and we had flooding. So, it just doesn't matter if it's a direct hit or not. We're just vulnerable here. Next slide. And tidal flooding, that sort of implies that your high tide is overtopped sort of the threshold that the Weather Service sets that basically identifies that there may be some impacts, inundation on roads, flooding in homes. It can happen on sunny days, so sometimes it's referred to as sunny day flooding or nuisance flooding. The story here is that the incidents of this happening are increasing exponentially up and down the East Coast. And that NOAA has a great outlook. NOAA says we've already seen a nearly 200% increase in high tide flooding days since 2000. We're fortunate in Delaware, we have 2 long period tide gauges that are recognized by the federal government. And the one that has the longest period is sort of a gold star in tide gauges is in Lewis. So it's fairly close to Dewey. And so the government, you'll often see them call out Lewis, but you were able to see that the number of days of high tide flooding are increasing in this region. And over the next 30 years, are certainly expected to increase quite a lot more. So what does that mean for a community like Dewey? It means that potentially, roads are impassable for more days of the year. Stormwater drains and systems back up, impacts to business activities and so forth. Next slide. And all 3 of those examples are exacerbated by sea level rise, which appears as an increase in the average height of the tide over time. In Delaware, we've had 14 to 16 inches of sea level rise over the past 100 years. And we're just unfortunately in a spot of the globe where we have twice the rate of sea level rise compared to the global average. And that's due to a lot of different factors. But that's not great for us. Go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to share with you that this year, the federal government, so Army Corps, NASA, NOAA, and others, partnered together to issue a new set of federal sea level rise scenarios. And these are really, really good quality scenarios based on the latest science. Delaware has a set of statewide scenarios that were done in 2017. I was on the committee that helped generate those. And those are good. They were based on the latest science at the time. But that's now 4 or 5 years ago. So I would recommend working from these sets of scenarios because they do contain regional factors and regional variability is considered in this. Sometimes you have to parse through the document and make sure if you're looking at it, that they're talking about national averages sometimes and projections, but you got to make sure you're looking at the Lewis. I would say it's basically Lewis projections because this is based on the tide gauge here. But bottom line is I wanted to just walk you through a little bit of what it means to look at a set of scenarios and how to incorporate it into planning. So with sea level rise, we know we have an excellent rate or an excellent track record of observations over thousands of years. Going forward, anticipating the rates of climate change, takes a combination of sound science and some, some sort of conjecture to try to understand what'll happen. Because we know certain processes that will be impacted. Warmer temperatures leads to warming oceans, and the oceans expand, for example. But what it's hard to predict is just what humankind will do. So a lot of sea level rise is driven by global warming, and that is influenced by the emissions going into the atmosphere. Going forward, we can't necessarily predict, with certainty just what will happen with the emissions into the future, because it depends on how the globe acts. So if mankind is serious and we're going after it in a very substantive way, and we're really reducing the emissions and tampering down the increase in the global temperatures, which sort of leads us to sea level rise, then we can expect the lower end of a scenario. But if it goes unabated, emissions continue maybe at a faster level, they're not reined in, then you're going to see the rate of sea level rise accelerate. That accounts for the higher scenarios. That's why there's a range of scenarios, essentially. It also has to do with processes like the ice sheets in Antarctica, how they are going to react. There is still, that's an emerging science that still has a little bit of uncertainty in it. Do not let uncertainty, though, keep you from planning. Scenarios present an excellent tool for planning because they give you a range of options and some flexibility. So if you are looking to put in a critical town asset, like your police station or whatnot, hopefully you'd want to plan to a higher scenario because that's being less tolerant of risk, essentially. You wanting to account for the maximum or near maximum that possibly could happen, if that's facility is in the floodplain. Whereas if you're, maybe putting in a park, maybe you're willing to accept some risk that, what you plan for may not have accounted for all the sea level rise that happens, that park may flood, but you're probably not risking lives necessarily in that situation. And there's price tags associated with those choices too. If you plan to higher scenarios, the cost could increase. I think Joe was addressing this before, that sometimes adaptive management is in order, where you might, because of the cost, you might have steps along the way where you might incrementally engineer something to successfully, over time, adapt to higher rates of sea level rise. So in other words, out into the future, the longer out you go, there is a little bit of uncertainty that's factored here, but you do have some room, and it's really a matter of knowing what your risk tolerances are. But now, the big headline coming out of these scenarios is that for the first time, the federal government has a high degree of confidence in what's going to happen between now and the year 2050. And that's because the observations that we've already observed, extrapolated out to 2050, are meshing quite well with the modeled projections, the different models that they use. And you can see that on this chart. This goes back to like 1970. They're showing you the observations there on the left, and then they're extrapolating out, and it's basically overlapping really well with the models. The models begin to diverge because of uncertainty in what happens with emissions and ice sheets. Okay, but what does this mean for Dewey Beach? Well, for the next 30 years, you have a high degree in confidence of what sea level rise will be like in 2050. So basically, over the last 100 years, we've had about 14 to 16 inches of sea level rise. Next slide. But now we're seeing that we will see as much sea level rise by 2050 as we saw from the past century. It's accelerating, and basically we're going to see another doubling of it. So this area is going to experience at least 1.5 feet, specifically 1.6 feet. This is what the federal government is saying. So that gives you something really to plan to. You may choose to want to plan further out, depending on what you are designing. Certain projects may, benefit from a longer tail. That's where you choose which scenario you want to plan to. But I think that gives you, a lot to work with. And it tells you that the time to act is now, because, you know, another 1.5 feet of sea level rise is going to be impactful. In fact, like Noah is saying, that, you know, moderate flooding will occur more, on average in the nation, more than 10 times as often as it does today. So moderate flooding, they would normally say something like 3 feet over mean high water. So that can cause damage to homes and buildings. Next slide. So NOAA has a sea level rise viewer. That web address is on top. And I really recommend you turn to this because it's incorporating the latest sea level rise projections. These are visualizations based on bathtub models, more or less, but they are showing sort of the inundation vulnerabilities. And in Dewey Beach, I imagine this is not too surprising. You have more vulnerability actually on the bay side as compared to the Atlantic coast, largely because you have an excellent dune system and you have slightly higher elevations on, you know, the Atlantic side. This is showing 2 feet because the tool doesn't let you go by halves, so I was able to look at 1 feet and 2 feet. 2 feet of sea level rise by 2060 would be the best projection based on an intermediate high scenario. And it shows you, you know, Reed Avenue and some of those locations as being potentially inundated. This is not including a storm. This is just sunny day kind of conditions. And then to the right, this of course is your 2100, you know, ways out, 5 feet of sea level rise. If you're thinking about the intermediate high scenario, there's quite a lot of risks there. Will we get to that? You know, there's a chance, right? And so it depends on how much risk the community wants to plan to and how much you're willing to tolerate. You may decide that that is just far beyond what you're willing to plan to, and then you might choose a different scenario, which might have 3 feet of sea level rise by 2100. This graphic on the left is also a feature of the tool. It just shows sort of where areas are likely or already experiencing high tide flooding. I think that kind of matches, hopefully, but if it doesn't, you know best. You know your community best, what's happening here. Next slide. Okay. So we talked about the hazard. Lots of hazards, right, related to flooding here, and sea level rise is exacerbating all of that. But another aspect of risk is exposure. It's the people, the places, and the things that are in the path of the hazard. Okay, and just because something's in the path of the hazard doesn't mean that it's going to be heavily impacted. That's more of an example of vulnerability, which is the next slide. Vulnerability refers to whether something is sensitive or has a higher or lower ability to adapt to the hazard. So for example, I'm fair-skinned, I'm very sensitive to sun, so I will burn, right? But I can adapt to that by putting on sunscreen or sitting under a beach umbrella. That's gonna give me more adaptive capacity. I can lower my vulnerability. You know, in a community setting, homes that are elevated, certainly that's an adaptive measure that they have to reduce their vulnerability. But there's lots of different ways that one can improve adaptive capacity and reduce sensitivity at a community scale, including, you know, maintaining the health of your wetlands and shorelines, and using higher standards, you know, as Jen spoke to, because that's all going toward reducing vulnerability. Next slide. And this graph is just showing, like, if you have a low ability to adapt and a higher sensitivity, you're going to have high vulnerability. So it's kind of an inverse relationship. Next slide. Okay, so I'm getting toward the end, but not totally at the end, but close. But the risk is about the intersection of the three: the hazard, the exposure, and the vulnerability. And we don't have as much control over the hazard. Let's say it. Like, we could kind of rein in our emissions, but that's not going to eliminate global warming. It'll slow it, But a lot of this is baked into the atmosphere and baked into the natural systems now, and we're going to be living with sea level rise. So what we can really control is vulnerability and exposure. From a community level, what Dewey can control is how many people, things, or buildings it puts in the path of the hazard, and it can control the adaptive capacity and the sensitivity of these people, places, and things in general. So that's, I think, an important takeaway I'd like to share with you, because as you think long-term, beyond a single project or two, but begin to think holistically about what your resilience strategy is. What is your vision for the town? Is it to reduce exposure? Is it to reduce vulnerability? Maybe a combination of both. But you're going to need to address one or both of them to really reduce risk, because you have less control over the hazard. There's some ways that you can mitigate things. We're going to talk about that in a second, but that needs to be kind of an underlying, conversation or consideration with your planning. Next slide. So I wanted to just briefly, review some of the types of adaptation and mitigation categories that exist. You have the types of efforts where you can protect people and things from the flooding, by keeping the flooding out, right? And then you have the types of categories where you can accommodate, which is like your bioswales, like Michelle mentioned, or elevating homes. And then there's a whole category of avoiding, right? Not building in a place where there's high risk. That's reducing exposure, essentially. And then retreating, right, is another category where you decide you're not going to, keep a home in that location. Maybe you're going to offer buyouts. You're going to convert, property to open space, marshland, because the costs start getting too high and the risks start getting too high. So that's a strategy as well. And I want to mention retreat, that can be kind of an ugly word on our coast. People often think about it in the context of a whole community leaving. It does not have to be. It's just about identifying spots in town where maybe economically and risk-wise, it doesn't make sense to keep maintaining it. So I'll throw that out there. Next slide. So some of the tools that the town has available to it, as Jen mentioned, building codes and ordinances, building in higher standards whenever possible so that you're reducing exposure and vulnerability through your building designs. Maybe you're minimizing the footprint on the parcel, the number of people that can live in a particular parcel. Maybe you're ensuring that the building is more able to withstand wave action and so forth. Nature-based solutions, another great example. Michelle covered that really well. Jen also covered, designing and retrofitting gray infrastructure to higher standards. I'd like to just throw in that, emergency operations and recovery planning is so critical. And you have a police department here. I'm sure they do some of this. But it's just so important, for example, that the town try to really work with the police department and DEMA to really encourage thinking about vulnerable populations, think about making sure residents are registered in Smart 911. For example, the Smart 911 means that if you have to call 911 and call the police or EMTs to your house, they know more information about you and your household. So if you have a member of the household that's deaf, or someone who has allergies, or someone that has trouble with mobility, they have more information to work with. I think, your different code reds and other, emergency notification systems, those are really important to ensure the town residents as well as your visitors are aware of them, and planning for recovery. Emergency operations, oftentimes we're focused on preparedness and then the response. But what happens if something like the Hurricane Ida flooding occurs like it did in Wilmington? and there's just some massive flooding in the town, what do we do to recover? Well, one step is to think about how you might rebuild. If the housing stock is heavily damaged or destroyed, this is devastating, but there's also an opportunity here. Do you rebuild in the same footprint and in the same way as before? Or do you use it as a way to kind of start fresh and think about the higher standards and the different approaches that might be needed? If you wait until the disaster occurs, you're not going to be in a position to be passing an ordinance and getting out in front of all the development that comes in right on the heels of that disaster. It's better to think about ordinances ahead of time that are kind of in your back pocket that can be rolled out for recovery. Thinking about your critical town operations and how to introduce redundancy is also really important. I think the town Bethany Beach, they bought land outside of town limits to create like a redundancy so that if they have a severe event and they can't operate in their town hall, they have another location to operate out of. They also can store, boats and trucks and equipment there. So that's really helpful. And then using the opportunity now to monitor your own conditions and document the flooding that's happening can be really helpful because, for example, when I mentioned high tide flooding and the numbers of days in Lewis that are going up, wouldn't it be great if Dewey could identify the number of days of high tide flooding in town and how many streets are impacted? And you might be able to see a progression, and that can be used in grant applications, to really support your competitiveness. It also helps you communicate to homeowners and visitors, why it could provide extra justification of why you might need to do something, which can include the establishment of a resilience fund. Bethany Beach has this, Lewis is looking into it, other communities up and down the coast have it. But the bottom line is that, this hazard is only going to increase, and all of our coastal towns are probably going to have to really wrestle with that. It's going to take more money than you have to really plan your way through this. So if you want to keep up with it and even get ahead of it, it's going to take a lot of money, more than the federal government has to give you, more than the state government has to give you. And so my recommendation is to begin thinking about some sort of capital improvement or resiliency fund that helps you with match dollars or helps you with recovery now, so that you have that to turn to. And be thinking about the skills in your own town hall and how you're able to evolve with the times. And that might include having staff with GIS skills or staff that understand resiliency, staff that are well versed in HAZUS, and have engineers on staff, things like that. Maybe having really staff dedicated to working on resilience issues could benefit the town in the long term. And then finally, making a pitch for education and outreach. So we're bringing our residents and towns, visitors along in the thought, the thinking, and the process of understanding that there's going to have to be some behavior change to accommodate all this. Just like in COVID, we kind of had to do a lot of behavior change, whether we wanted to or not. But we did. We adapted. Like outdoor dining, that was an adaptation. And we can adapt to flooding and sea level rise too. We just have to be creative and accepting, and that takes a lot of education. And it takes having a lot of networks to support us through this process. Next slide. I think that's my last slide. So going forward is, my thoughts are, understand the hazard and what is most at risk in the town. And I guess maybe even think about the scope in terms of your committee. Are you going to focus on city-owned assets? Are you focused on residential? Both? Business? Like, what's going to be the scope of your planning? What are the timeframes you want to plan to? And that may differ depending on the projects. Certain infrastructure projects may have a longer, lifetime than others, but I think it's helpful to know what you want to plan to And you can have an iterative process where you revisit that over time. And then knowing which assets are your top priority, and what you have the most control over. And then in particular, knowing what are the community's values and needs versus their wants, because you're going to be faced with a lot of headwinds, on as you start doing some of the harder projects, you're going to have to grapple with a lot of competing needs and wants. So really sorting them out. What are the needs versus the wants? And then, ultimately crafting a vision of how the town can best position itself to meet those future needs. Having that vision expressed in a statement can guide your planning in the long run. And again, this can be iterative. You can adjust it over time, but it gives you a guidepost. So I'll leave you with that. I think it's a lot, but this community has a lot of heart and soul. That's a strength. It's a strength that you've stood up this committee. It's a strength that you've reached out to partners. There are partners that can support you. And I think you're doing the right things by trying to educate yourself and figure out what's next. So thanks.
Thank you, Danielle. Any questions for Danielle? Very much.
I had one.
Keep it quick, Dave. We're trying to get through.
Gate protection.
I know how to answer that.
I mean, at the RASCO conference, the assistant town manager, Bethany, described the frequency and depth of flooding there. And I get the impression for them, it was probably 5 years ago.
I think that the Association of Coastal Towns is a very important body because by working together, you can enhance your competitiveness for grants, and you can speak with a louder voice. Sometimes within the 7 communities, you may have slightly differing priorities, and that just has to get worked out. I couldn't speak to what the priority would be for the Association of Coastal Towns on that, but fortunately, they do have a lot of meetings, and I'm sure they're looking at it.
That's been one of the topics that we've talked about, approaching that organization and talking with the members and finding out what their priorities are, seeing if we can form a coalition.
I think it's great. There are meetings this coming year.
Mm-hmm.
Very good work.
Yep, happy to help.
Last thing on our agenda is I'd like to have Bill give us a quick overview of some of the current projects that are going on in town and their near-term plan, just so we have a level set on that.
Yeah, first I want to say thanks for putting this together, and for DENREC, especially Jennifer, with approval for the sign down there on the stormwater pipe that we're going to be able to put in after the beach replenishment. Much for the work on the Army Corps of Engineers. Really appreciate it. And for Senator Elam Bay Michelle. Thank you so much for coming in. So real quick, if we go to the next slide, please. These projects, they aren't actually voted on yet. But this is what I'd like to see in this order. Former Mayor Cook and the infrastructure. Our engineers back on the 29th of November. Some of the members from the infrastructure committee were down there. We talked about it with the engineers. They're coming up with some estimates. Supposed to be getting us an estimate on that. What we're looking for right now are the plans when that was built 12 years ago. We're so interested in the concrete and some of the design of that. Complete stormwater phase 1, which is Swedes down to Reach, almost completely done with the exception of probably a very pipe that's down around Rodney Street. Then it'll be completely finished, and then we want to evaluate phase 2, which would be from Rodney Street down to Collins Street. We want to get doesn't need to be done at all, and what needs to be replaced. Then there's the Sunset Park project that something I'm working with DelDOT to try to get funding from them to do this. And then possibly use pavers of some sort. That was one of the priorities, and then also from the 2012 study, that was the first one that was done. But there, we have to get DelDOT's approval for that. You know, we did put some pervious asphalt in on the north side. It's worked well so far for us with getting water off that side of the street, but it's in the park, not on a regular traveled part of the road. But that's kind of what we have going on. If you, go ahead to number 1. That's Reed. Number 2, Sunset Park with Senator Elam Bays. That's New Orleans Street. And you see where this great job that Denrec's done with the Army Corps of Engineers of building this dune up 15 feet up in the air. And if you don't believe it's that high, when the water has come washed out part of the dune, try to get up off the beach when you're climbing at those dune crossings, and you'll know that it's about to climb up to the top. So that's what we got next. Our projects from Sweet Street basically down to Reed Street, we are almost complete. Rodney Street, basically down to Collins Street. We're going to look at those stormwater pipes and see what type of condition they're in. Are there any questions for me?
We get a copy of this to post in our repository so we have it generally available to people. I think that'd be
Yeah,
good.
what we may do
Yep.
is we could actually have them on our town website too.
Sure,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Celia?
Bill, I just, polarized standard that you're using across all your projects. It's like
money.
money.
Our current budget's about $600,000. That's approximately that's in the infrastructure funds right now.
So you're planning to whatever the funding allows.
Right, and then whatever money we could use from either ARPA or the BRIC or any of these other grants that may have.
Water and sediment regulations don't automatically factor in sea level rise, right? They're based on the 100-year storm, which is a FEMA. Might want to add in sea level rise on top of that if the funding allows. I realize you have constraints, but and then going forward, the town having a standard sea level rise projection that they want to plan to,
Right.
then you can kind of figure all the projects, and the projects are kind of designed according to the same set of standards.
All being raised about 9.5 feet,
That,
right? It'd be parking underneath it.
awesome.
Right, that's what we're looking at right now. Of course, we have to contend with our height restriction. We don't want to go over that by a lot because we're telling other homeowners that you have to be below this, and we want to try to. Any other questions?
Two quick ones, Bill. Oh, go ahead, Gary.
Well, I was gonna say, is that 9.5 feet, is that?
So that's going to be from where the bottom, where we would have a drain in the bottom of the garage area to the top of the first floor.
Base point elevation? I think
Right,
that's-
plus 1.
I think that's 85.
Their flood elevation, the person that came in during the presentation, we're working with them on that, how high it should be.
Is there some applications? I know there's an e-blast that you get once in a while if there's a storm coming to town that satisfies the need to do something like evacuate people, vehicles, things of that nature in areas we know will be flooded on the bayside. Do we have something that gives that kind of notification?
So right now, what I'll do is we look at the weather warnings that come out, then I'll ask Kate to send out an e-blast to everybody that signed up on that. We also are looking at took on and Rehoboth has used in the past. Something that'll let you sign up for text messaging, which might be easier than the e-blast. But right now, we don't have a set system. It's just, I look at the weather, whether it's snow or flooding, I'll type something up, I'll send it over to Kate. Kate will put it out and it'll say something like, make sure any unsecured property that's that's in any type of objects, move your cars
Right.
over to the ocean side, off the bay side, so they don't get flooded. We'll put out some type of warning like that. But,
That's as good as we have the coverage for the people who receive that, right?
Right.
Yeah, basically. But that's what you have. One other thing. Do we track stats of, how many flood days a year and, which storms for which period of time there was certain streets were flooded?
I haven't been doing that.
Can we do something like that beginning in 2020? I mean, I can bring it up through the council to do, but
Yeah.
it seems like it's worth doing to understand. I remember when the Anne Marie, I think it was from Lewis, no, it was Teresa from South Bethany, said they know exactly how many storm days that they have in a given year, and they track that. I think that would be helpful for us to know and be able to monitor over time.
And it sounds like it would help us in our grant right now too. Right?
Yes,
Right.
indeed.
You can enlist volunteers.
Sure, sure, just someone to log the information, right? Okay, thank you, Bill.
I had a question that's related to Danielle's. Let's assume that we get GAP or BRIC money, a big bag with $5 million in it, and we can do these phase 1 and phase 2 storm projects on McKinley and Reed and all that. And 2025 comes around, and great, it's working as planned and intended. At what level of rise to Rehoboth Bay does that system lose half of its capacity or ability to function? If it's up in guard, it doesn't work at all because it's gravity based and it's low to the area. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe it needs to go up 4 feet. But at what point do we start running into problems?
Right. So it looks like Reed Avenue.
And we need to factor that in
Yeah.
as a cushion along the line of that extra foot or two of freeboard kind of.
That's actually the reason that we're doing all of this and the planning that we'll be starting. I think the first step is the coordination of what our goals and our reasonable expectations are. And that's a good segue I just want to wrap up with just a couple of comments, if I may. I talked earlier about GAP and the BRIC program, and you just mentioned it. The GAP program will offer money and, as Danielle indicated, help in planning and actual, prioritization. So what we may do is the next meeting, which will probably be scheduled for January at some point, we may want to ask their help in getting a session together, and maybe it'll be a workshop again, hopefully better attended one. But it would enable us to actually begin the process of organizing our thoughts on all the things that you've all brought up in terms of how to prioritize and the scope and the definition of the different areas that we need to address. So that is what we plan to do. In fact, I'm going to be in touch with GAP early next week. Daniel?
Okay, yeah. GAP is a grant writing assistance program. They don't have actual funding, but what they do is connect you to funding opportunities.
Right, like BRIC.
Yeah,
Right,
exactly.
right.
Yeah.
But just the facilitation that they can help with, and then of course, when we get to the point where we need money for grants, that's, the grant writing process itself. I think that's what I heard in the summit. Those two organizations together can really be the key thing that's help propel us forward. Any other questions or comments for today? I know everyone's ready to adjourn. Okay. Thank you very much for your attendance. With no further business, we will adjourn the meeting. Thank you for coming.